On the 2nd of February, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus walked out of the ruins of a department store basement in Stalingrad and surrendered to the Soviet army. The first German field marshal ever taken prisoner. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers had been trapped inside that pocket. Roughly 91,000 marched out alive. Most never came home. By every measure that makes a battle look like a turning point, Stalingrad qualifies. The scale was catastrophic. The symbolism was overwhelming. Hitler had personally promised Stalingrad would fall. When it didn't, when an entire German army surrendered on live newsreel, Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning and pivoted from the promise of victory to the terror of what defeat would mean. The regime never fully recovered its credibility after that. You've probably been told Stalingrad was the turning point of the Eastern Front. It wasn't. Less than 3 weeks after Paulus surrendered, Erich von Manstein launched a counter-offensive, retook Kharkov, the third largest city in the Soviet Union, and stabilized the entire southern front. The Wehrmacht had just suffered the worst defeat in its history. And it came back. That single fact breaks the whole argument. A turning point is the moment after which the outcome becomes irreversible. Stalingrad didn't do that. So the question is, what did? Subscribe if you want history that goes deeper than the textbook version. This argument survived 80 years because both sides needed it. This video explains why and what actually changed when you strip away the propaganda. The case for Stalingrad deserves to be taken seriously before it's challenged. It's not wrong. It's incomplete. Start with the scale. Germany and its Axis allies lost somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 men in the campaign. Historians' estimates vary depending on how broadly you define it. The Sixth Army's destruction eliminated one of Germany's most experienced formations. 900 aircraft gone. 500 tanks. The strategic position Germany had been building toward, control of the Volga, the oil routes from the Caucasus, the splitting of the Soviet Union along a north-south axis, abandoned permanently. But the numbers aren't even the most important part. Before Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht had been beaten once, at Moscow in December 1941. The German public absorbed that through the lens of winter, exhaustion, overextension. Something had gone wrong, not the army itself. At Stalingrad, that excuse wasn't available. A full German army in a battle Hitler had personally prioritized, surrounded and destroyed. No weather, no overextension, just defeat. Goebbels understood immediately that the propaganda line had to change. On the 18th of February, 1943, he stood before a carefully selected crowd in Berlin and demanded total war. The promise of easy victory was dead. What replaced it was fear, of Soviet retribution, of what losing would actually mean. That pivot cost Germany something it never got back. The Soviets understood the symbolic value too. Stalingrad became the centerpiece of the Soviet war narrative for the next 50 years. The Red Army had turned the tide. Socialist mobilization had beaten fascist aggression. It was useful. It was also partially true. So what's missing from that picture? 17 days after Paulus surrendered, the front that was supposed to be collapsing was fighting back. The Soviet leadership had read the map correctly. After Stalingrad, the German position across the entire southern sector was disintegrating. Army Group South was stretched across hundreds of miles of steppe, flanks exposed, reserves exhausted, supply lines cut in places. Soviet commanders saw total collapse within reach. One more push and the southern front was gone. They pushed. Soviet rifle divisions were already operating at a fraction of their authorized strength after months of winter offensive. Tank armies were nearly out of armor and fuel. The supply lines couldn't follow the advance. Manstein saw it coming. Manstein's operation, launched on the 19th of February, was a masterpiece of improvisation. Using a handful of SS Panzer divisions and the remnants of shattered formations, he let the Soviet advance overextend, cut it off, then destroyed it in detail. Kharkov was retaken on the 15th of March. The front stabilized. The position that had looked like total collapse 6 weeks earlier was restored. A force that has passed a strategic turning point doesn't do that. Not in 3 weeks. The Wehrmacht at Kharkov was still capable of the kind of mobile warfare that had built its reputation. The war was not yet lost. So if Stalingrad wasn't the moment, what was both sides so determined to pretend it was? Zhukov knew. Manstein knew. The men who actually fought the war understood the strategic significance of what happened at Kursk within weeks of the cancellation order. Neither side admitted that in print. Because this is where the argument stops being about military analysis and starts being about who needed the story to land a certain way. The Soviet case is straightforward. Stalin had personally invested in defending the city bearing his name. The imagery of Stalingrad, the encirclement, the ruined city, the German field marshal in captivity was too powerful to subordinate to a more accurate but less cinematic analysis. Soviet historians codified Stalingrad as the moment the war changed for 50 years, because that framing served the political mythology of the Soviet state. The German case is more specific. If Stalingrad was the turning point, then there's a clear before and after. Hitler refused the breakout. Hitler's micromanagement overrode professional judgment. The generals were right. The politician was catastrophically wrong. The officers who survived the war needed that story. It protected their reputations. Kursk doesn't give them that protection. At Kursk, in July 1943, the German High Command, the same generals whose memoirs built the Stalingrad narrative, planned, prepared, and executed an offensive with full resources and months of preparation. The strategic initiative was still nominally theirs. If Kursk is the turning point, the generals can't blame Hitler alone. They designed and launched the operation that broke Germany's offensive capacity permanently. That's why it gets buried. Operation Citadel launched on the 5th of July, 1943. Germany committed roughly 700,000 men, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, 2,000 aircraft. What waited for them had been 3 months in the making. 300,000 Soviet civilians, mostly women and elderly men, dug trenches day and night. A layered intelligence operation combining frontline partisan networks, intercepted communications, and the Switzerland-based Lucy spy ring fed Soviet commanders a near-complete picture of German intentions. Nearly 2 million troops were in position across Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front in the north and Nikolai Vatutin's Voronezh Front in the south, with Ivan Konev's Stepa Front held in reserve. More than 5,000 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces. The German plan was a pincer, north and south into the Kursk salient, encircle what was inside, destroy it. Sound in concept. The problem was time. The planning had stretched for months. Hitler kept delaying, waiting for the new Panther tanks that General Heinz Guderian had explicitly warned weren't combat ready. Dozens caught fire or snapped their final drives before they reached the start line. The Soviets used every week of that delay to build the most sophisticated defensive system the war had produced. 8 defensive belts, each designed to channel and exhaust attacking armor before the next one engaged. Minefields at 2,400 per linear mile of front, so dense that German combat engineers clearing lanes for the panzers came under pre-sighted artillery fire before they could finish. Walter Model's northern pincer stalled within 2 days, less than 6 miles gained. The southern pincer under Hermann Hoth made better progress. The engagement at Prokhorovka on the 12th of July remains the most legendary tank battle of the war, even if Soviet accounts vastly inflated the German losses to justify their own heavy casualties. But it too failed to achieve the breakthrough Citadel required. On the 13th of July, Hitler summoned Manstein and Field Marshal Günther von Kluge to the Wolf's Lair and ended it. The Allied invasion of Sicily 3 days earlier, combined with a massive Soviet counter-offensive already tearing into the German rear at Orel, had made the calculation impossible. German records show around 250 to 300 tanks as immediate write-offs during the offensive phase. That number is misleading. Hundreds more were crippled by mines and anti-tank fire, waiting for recovery that never came. When the German retreat began, the repair system collapsed. Tanks abandoned in the field counted the same as tanks destroyed in combat. The loss of the battlefield turned damaged into lost. After Kursk, Germany had no panzer reserve left for a major offensive on the Eastern Front. Every operation that followed was reactive, plugging gaps, responding to Soviet pressure, trying to stabilize lines that kept breaking. The Soviets launched Operation Kutuzov the day after Citadel was cancelled, then Operation Rumyantsev in August, then a cascade through the autumn and winter that Germany lacked the strength to stop. The front moved west from July 1943 to May 1945. It never moved east again. One battle produced images: the ruined city, the frozen prisoners, a field marshal walking out of a basement. The other produced tank formations moving across open steppe, a cancellation order issued at a headquarters hundreds of miles from the front. There's no photograph that captures what Kursk meant strategically. The causal chain at Stalingrad was clean. Hitler forbade the breakout. An army died. At Kursk, there were planning failures, mechanical breakdowns, 8 defensive belts, and a decision to cancel that was simultaneously reasonable and catastrophic. That story is harder to follow, and ownership mattered. The Soviet state needed a city named after Stalin to be the moment the war changed. The surviving German officer corps needed a battle they could blame entirely on Hitler's interference. Kursk gave neither side what they needed. Germany attacked, failed, and withdrew, and the Soviet victory was defensive rather than dramatic. History remembers what the people who survived it needed to remember. Stalingrad was catastrophic. It destroyed an army, shattered a myth, forced the Nazi regime to abandon its most powerful propaganda line. All of that is real. None of it makes Stalingrad where the war actually changed, because that moment is defined by what comes after, not by how devastating it was at the time. What came after Stalingrad was Kharkov, a counter-offensive of genuine operational brilliance that proved the Wehrmacht could still function, still adapt, still threaten. The trajectory was not irreversible. What came after Kursk was the permanent loss of strategic initiative. German commanders would fight brilliant tactical retreats, Model, Manstein, men who knew exactly what they were doing, but the moment when Germany chose when and where to fight on the Eastern Front was gone. After Kursk, the Soviets made that choice. They made it for 22 months without interruption. That is the turning point. Both sides prefer Stalingrad for the same reason both sides found it useful in 1943. It tells a story where the outcome was decided by identifiable mistakes, specific failures, a gamble that went wrong. That story can be blamed on Hitler's decisions, on Paulus's compliance, on one catastrophic winter. Kursk can't be explained away that cleanly. Germany's best commanders, its best remaining equipment, a defensive position they knew existed, months of preparation. And they still failed. After Kursk, the professional military that had been managing Hitler's strategic mistakes since 1941 ran out of room to manage them. The war was over. It just kept going for another 22 months. 2 positions. Neither concedes. Stalingrad broke the psychological back of Nazi Germany, the civilian morale, the propaganda credibility, the myth of inevitable German victory. Without that collapse, the political conditions for defeat look different. Morale is a force multiplier. Stalingrad destroyed it. Call it the turning point. Or Kursk ended Germany's ability to determine the course of the war. Morale is powerful, but operational capacity sets the absolute limit of what an army can achieve. After July 1943, Germany's operational capacity on the Eastern Front was no longer sufficient to change the outcome. That's your turning point. So which one is it? Psychology or logistics? Drop it below. Subscribe if this changed how you read the Eastern Front. Thanks for watching.